Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Tom, other than books, which I know you're a collector of, have you ever been a collector of anything?
A collector of anything?
Do you collect things?
Not really.
No.
I
haven't either. In baseball cards when I was a kid, but that was sort of the extent of it.
You know, it's a weird thing. I mean, I'm still a baseball fan. I grew up. I love the game. I never really got into baseball cards. I had a few here and there. Nothing, rare or fancy or anything. I don't know. And I've never really been a collector of anything.
Really?
Yeah.
So I mean, but you do collect books, right?
I do collect books.
I would say that is probably your if you're going to go out and just spend something to build a collection.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, my wife teases me. That's mostly what I buy. If there's a package that shows up from Amazon for me, it's 99%. It's probability it's a book.
We actually have a member. I'm not going to call him out by name.
Yeah,
but we have a member who has been put on a book limit because he was buying so many. By his significant other. So I asked because in the last week or two, we have had two record-breaking auction sales that I found kind of interesting. The first was the most expensive car ever sold at auction was sold 2 weeks ago. It was a 1955 Mercedes-Benz SLR.
Okay.
So the 1950 SLR Coupe.
Okay.
The 1955 Mercedes SL Coupe is the gull-wing door coupe, the sort of one of the most famous cars of all time. This is the gull-wing coupe, but it's the racing edition. There were two of them ever made, and one of them sold for $143 million at auction.
Wow.
It was the largest.
That's amazing for a car.
For a car, $143 million.
Yeah.
And then as I was riding in this morning, and I've been thinking about that, just trying to process that. Then I'm driving in this morning and I'm listening
not in your 1955.
Not in my 1955
Mercedes SLR Coupe.
But for those who we've talked about this, right? I grew up with my father rebuilding cars, and when I was really young, he was really into Mercedes. Yeah. So that was sort of always the dream for us was a 1955 Mercedes Coupe.
Right.
Not an SLR. I mean, you don't even find those to work on, but an SL Coupe. They were, when I was growing up, high tens of thousands, low hundred thousands.
Right.
To buy something restored. If you wanted to restore it yourself, we're talking 30.
Yeah.
At that point, it was still a lot of money, and never were in a position to buy one and actually work on it. And the parts weren't easy to come by and everything else. But we did 3 or 4 Mercedes while I was growing up. So I have some connection to that car.
Right.
Then this morning I'm driving in here and driving to our studio, and I came across another record-breaking auction sale.
Okay.
A guitar.
Okay.
More specifically, a 1969 Fender Mustang guitar that was played by Kurt Cobain in the song Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Yeah.
In the original recording.
Okay.
Sold for $4.5 million.
Wow.
A Fender guitar sold for $4.5 million.
That's amazing.
And it just got me thinking about people who collect things and all of these, the amount of money that people spend. Now, it turns out the Fender, we still don't know. I think there's been rumors and there's been hints. The buyer of the Mercedes was sold in Stuttgart. It was actually not sold in the United States. It was sold in Europe, in Germany, and it was bought by a broker on behalf of a private collector who didn't want anybody to know. Now, that said, there are only so many people in this country or in this world
who can
afford that. So you can start to narrow it down.
Right.
One of the obvious that a lot of people have been pointing to is Ralph Lauren. Or officially Ralph Lifshitz, as his real name is. But I don't know if you've ever seen Ralph Lauren's car collection is spectacular.
Okay.
And actually keeps many of them here in Colorado. A few miles outside of Aspen, he has a significant ranch that he built enough roads on his ranch that he can go race his cars on private land, so nobody can bother him about it.
Now, Dave, I got to tell you, I'm deeply opposed to and offended by these auctions because, see, I believe in car equity and guitar equity, and I just don't think it's right that some owners of some cars are getting paid more for their car than other people get paid. Shouldn't everyone who puts up a used car for sale just get paid the same?
Well, every car should be the same price, right?
Right.
It doesn't matter how fast it goes. It doesn't
Right.
matter the quality or
more
how long
importantly,
it lasts.
it shouldn't matter how much people value it.
Right, right.
I mean, I'm being facetious here, but what auctions demonstrate, all auctions, is the subjectivity of value.
Yep.
Different people value different things in different amounts. Somebody valued that car, that 1955 Mercedes, to the, what was it,
54 million.
154 million. They valued it. They'd rather have the car
Yes.
than $154 million, right, in their checking account. Not many people would value that car to that extent. And so the point is, different people value things in different ways and in different amounts, which is why different things sell for different amounts. It's why different employees get paid different amounts. I say all that, right, because there's been this ongoing movement to pass legislation that would require like all, male and female athletes and things like this, right, to get paid exactly the same, when the point is people don't value them the same, which is why, it's why, for example, an NBA team, the NBA has a billion Chinese, which we've talked about on this podcast, right, who want to watch NBA games and buy NBA gear, right? And they're into they value the NBA, the WNBA, not so much, not as much, which is why right, there's not as much demand for it. People aren't spending as much money on it, which is why the WNBA doesn't have the kind of resources to pay their employees, their players, the kinds of numbers that the NBA can play.
For as progressive as he likes to claim he is, I always wondered why LeBron James doesn't take 90% of his salary and send it to the NBA, the WNBA Players Association, to be distributed amongst the players. There's two other economic lessons that I want people to take away from this. First of all, we need to remember that the first reaction of your average progressive in America today, when you say, oh, a car just sold for $154 million, that's absurd. Nobody should ever pay $154 million for a car. But let's remember that it's not like that money gets spent and it just disappears into some black hole somewhere, right? There are a lot of people who end up making money for different jobs that they're doing. There were a lot of people involved. There was the auction house that has to put everything together. They're the people who work for the auction house. This keeps them employed. That keeps them working. The people who helped restore the car and keep it in perfect condition got paid to make it worth that. All of these things, that $154 million doesn't just all of a sudden vanish. It now gets put back into the economy where other people are spending it and other people are earning different pieces of that $154 million. It drives me crazy when I hear somebody say, well, a car should never sell for that kind of money. Well, somebody valued it at that. And a lot of people are going to benefit from the fact that that person did. More importantly, we have this situation today where we heard all through Trump's presidency, and we've heard this about Republicans and conservatives for years, free market people for years. You only care about the wealthiest people in the world. Right. And we have this huge wealth gap and we have this huge wealth disparity. Well, Biden's been in office for 2 years now ish. Are we getting closer? Are we closing that wealth disparity? Or are we watching the middle class and the lower classes struggle more while somebody is still capable of spending $154 million on a car or $4.5 million on a guitar? And you start to think about it in those terms. And I'm sitting there thinking about this and I'm listening to this as I'm driving here today. I stopped for gas and gas costs $4.90 a gallon.
Right. And who's that hurting?
Right.
It's not hurting the guy who just paid $154 million.
Exactly right.
Right.
The guy who just spent $154 million.
He can afford gas.
He's probably handpicking where the gas is coming from. I want to know. There's an old joke. There was a show on IFC or Comedy Central a bunch of years ago, and it was a very left-leaning show, but it was kind of funny. It was still in the days of when SNL was kind of funny. It was called Portlandia.
Okay.
And it was making fun of how progressive Portland had become.
Okay.
One of the most famous scenes from Portlandia was a small skit of a guy and his wife walking in, and so they weren't quite progressive enough, right? Because it was a traditional couple.
A male and a female.
A male and a female.
Married to each other.
Right.
Wow.
And they had walked in.
Yeah.
And they get their menu at a restaurant, and there's steak on the restaurant, and they're going through the menu, and on the menu it says, today's steak, it features Roy. And they named the cow.
Right.
And they talked about the diet the cow ate, and they talked about where the cow was raised and what the cow liked to do on a day-to-day basis.
Roy liked to be scratched behind his ears.
Exactly. Exactly right. But the show, as you sit there and they're making fun of this, it goes back to the guy who's paying $154 million for a car.
Yeah.
He probably wants to know, where was the oil rig and what refinery.
Right.
I mean, if you're putting gas in that car, I want to know what the refinery was. I want to know the practice.
Yeah.
You want that car to stay valuable.
Well, a couple points here. One is, but back to this whole notion of equity, I've pointed out, if you just take that argument, that idea, it's not really an argument, an idea, and you run with it, you end up in some ridiculous places that even progressives don't want. If men and women in the same industry should be paid the same, then doesn't it also follow that, for example, shouldn't all men within an industry be paid the same? Shouldn't all football players be paid the same as all other football players? How dare some team pay a bunch of money to a hotshot young quarterback, or maybe an old quarterback, maybe Tampa, right? Pays a bunch of money to Tom Brady. Shouldn't they just all be paid the same? Why does a starting pitcher like Garrett Cole, how can you justify paying him many times more than, the lowliest utility player for the Cincinnati Reds?
Right.
I mean, you end up in these just ridiculous realm that even progressives themselves reject.
Have you followed? I didn't want to go down this path today, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but we did have, you and I spent some time during the NCAA tournament talking about name, image, and likeness.
Yes.
And I don't know if you follow, but there is a big public fight happening right now between the University of Alabama coaching staff and Texas A&M University's coaching staff. Texas A&M has now, by all prognosticators' viewpoint, has recruited the greatest freshman class in college football history.
Okay.
And they've done it through name, image, and likeness. They have purchased the greatest freshman recruiting class of all time, because they've got all these oil barons who are out there saying, hey, that was my school. I went to A&M. I want you guys to win a national championship.
Yeah.
And what is it going to take? I'll sponsor them. They can be the they can endorse my oil rig.
Right.
That's going to fill the $154 million car.
Right.
And it's now become this big public fight, and everybody's sort of talking about the ridiculousness of it, because we all think Nick Saban's been doing this at Alabama for over a decade, right? He's been
just under the table.
He's been under the table. And now that it's public, he's got plenty of boosters going out and doing the same thing.
Right.
And making sure. But he's saying, nope, you're violating the rules, because technically, according to the NCAA, name, image, and likeness sales are okay, but you can't use it to convince a kid to come to your school. Which, how do you ever prove that? Right. I mean, it just seems like another progressive policy, right?
Yeah.
We can't actually prove anything. So we're going to just tell you what it feels like to us.
Yeah.
If it feels like you're using this money to recruit, and Nick Saban says, it feels to me like they're using that money to recruit the best class. So I want you to punish them.
And yet at the same time, right? So that's what wealthy people are able to do. They're able to put together great, freshman football classes in universities for ordinary Americans who are not buying football teams, right? Man, everything's looking, it's looking tough. I mean, we have real shortages caused by numerous things, production shortages, distribution chain disruptions, government agencies going in and shutting down baby formula factories.
Right.
You know, we all remember from Econ 101 when supply goes down, when there's less of anything, and there's still a lot of demand for it, well, the price goes up. Mm-hmm. Prices are going up in part naturally, in part artificially. We have inflation. The dollar is becoming worth less and less with every day that's going by. And so all this is putting the squeeze on regular Americans, and especially poor Americans. This is the hardest for poor Americans. And for progressives who wring their hands and they say, well, this is just terrible because there's an income gap. Dave, there's a gap. So some people are earning more money. Some people make more money. Some people create more wealth than others. I think I've mentioned this before, and if I haven't, I'm going to mention it now. Our friend Anthony Davies, good guy, fellow traveler. He's an economist. He teaches at the University of Duquesne, and he has his own website. If you go there, somewhere on there, Anthony puts together these very elaborate PowerPoint slides.
Right.
There is a slideshow where he demonstrates with data around the globe over many decades where you find more economic freedom, more individual liberty, where people are protected relatively, by law in their property, and for the most part can do what they want to do with their own labor, their own property. The income gap shrinks. Because a couple of things happen. Number one, poor people create wealth, and they become not poor anymore. They become middle class, and in some cases, quite wealthy. And at the same time, some wealthy people squander it away.
Yeah,
lose a bunch of money. I mean, famous. This is a famous American story where someone, some entrepreneurial mind creates a big business empire, and then his kids just blow it all away, right? And destroy the thing. So the income cap goes down when there's more freedom. Where there's less freedom, in the worst tyrannies and despotisms, that's where you find enormous income gaps that never change.
Sure.
The rich, the ones who are in power, they're living in palaces, in some cases literally lined with gold. And it's their families that are the next generation living in those palaces, right? And the poor people, if you're poor in, if you're poor in Yemen, if you live in Yemen and you're poor, you're likely, and I don't say this, I'm not saying this in a mocking way, I'm being quite serious. You're probably eating bugs.
Well,
or rodents or something terrible, because there's literally no food. And so that question, what are you going to eat today, is always pressing. And some days it's nothing. You're not going to eat anything at all. And those people who are poor, they stay poor. Their kids are poor. Their grandkids are poor. Their great, like it's generational.
The greatest example of that in the world today is North Korea.
Yeah.
Right? We've talked about that several times before. The Kim family. I mean, Kim Jong, we're on Kim Jong Un now. Is it Kim Jong Un is the current?
Ill.
I never remember which is the father, which is the son.
Yep.
But neither of them really went and created any value for anybody else. They had it passed down, and it has continued to pass down. But the Kim family lives in palaces and
private chefs,
right? I mean,
who bring out on literal silver platters. Like, we're not even exaggerating here. Platters actually made of silver and gold, and that's what they eat on.
And meanwhile, the most reports out of North Korea is the average North Korean eats grass, with most of its meals. Grass, that you'd find in your front yard.
Yes,
I'm not talking about something you get at Jamba Juice.
Yeah,
right. Actual grass is your meal, and that's never going to change. There is no system in North Korea for that to ever change.
Short of like a revolution.
Right.
That's the only way it could change. There's nothing within the political and economic regime of North Korea that allows for a person who's really dirt poor to become wealthy. And, here we should remind our members a couple of just key insights and ideas that are life changing, that are history changing when they're embraced. One being the idea that wealth is created. It has to be created. It can be created. People make fun of me because I get really excited when I start talking about wealth creation. But honestly, that is one of the most inspiring and hopeful of all ideas ever discovered by the human mind, that no matter what condition you were born into the world, maybe you were born into terrible poverty and all kinds of unfortunate circumstances, as long as you are actually free, as long as you are secure in your property and in your liberty, you can create new wealth by producing value for other people. Just because you're born poor in a state of freedom, that doesn't mean you have to die poor.
As long as it's not taken away from you by somebody else.
That's absolutely right. And the other piece of this, which I think is going to tie into where I think our conversation might end up going, and I'm going to reference another name. This was Bert Folsom. He was a colleague of mine at Hillsdale College. Actually, his door is just a few doors down from me, and we used to spend a lot of time. He went through my book on Lincoln in great detail and actually made some wonderful edits to it. Bert wrote this wonderful little book now 25, maybe 30 years ago, titled The Myth of the Robber Baron. It's a short little book. I can't recommend this book highly enough. Bert's a historian, got his PhD in history. And as he was working his way through college and graduate school with an emphasis on history, he noticed this theme coming out from all the most prominent progressive historians, labeling the great capitalists, the great business minds and men, for the most part, of the late 19th century, early 20th century.
Vanderbilt, Carnegie,
that whole group, yes, J.P. Morgan,
right,
as robber barons, right? And you think about that phrase, robber baron, a baron, so they're kind of like royalty, they're elite, and they're robbers. They're thieves. The way that they got wealthy was they stole it. And so this became a great point of interest for Bert. Were these guys actually thieving royalists of some sort? And what he discovered is no, most of them, with a few exceptions, most of them were entrepreneurial and went and they created enormous amounts of wealth for themselves by producing better quality products and offering them for sale at lower prices,
right,
which benefited everyone, especially poor people, So there's Rockefeller out there saying, hey, I've got better oil. I've got better oil for your lamps.
Yep.
And if you buy my oil, it's going to be cheaper and it's going to burn longer, right? And what Bert does in his book, right, I'm starting on the first page, he makes a distinction between market entrepreneurs and political entrepreneurs. Market entrepreneurs are people who go out into a market, and there's already others out there, right? Businesses and people producing things, and they think, okay, how can I compete? How can I make a better product and offer it at a lower price and market it better to a bigger, all of that, right? That competitive, rough and tumble world of business where nothing's guaranteed. And then there are political entrepreneurs who say, I don't want to go compete. I don't want to make anything and sell things. I'm just going to become friends. maybe pass along some bribes,
right,
a little grift to keep people in the political realm. And then they will, either grant subsidies to my business and I'll make a bunch of money off that, or they'll pass regulations that benefit my business and put the squeeze on my competitors, things like that. And so I mentioned just before, when you look around the world, this is what Anthony Davies demonstrates with great detail. Where there is less freedom, where there is more government control and regulation and power, you have bigger income gaps between the rich and the poor. At the same time, where you have more government control, more central planning, you end up with more political entrepreneurship, right? Because anybody who's ambitious, if you're living under a tyranny and you're ambitious, you want a better life, what do? You go saddle up with with those in politics, in the government.
Some crony deal with somebody in government.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, for those who have been listening to us for a while, we're this is podcast 104 at this point. So so this goes way back. But those who have been listening to us from the beginning, we talked about this early on about that TV show, The Men Who Built America, where it talked a lot about this. And we talked about the towns that sprung up along the railroad, right?
Yes.
So you had these guys like Vanderbilt and Carnegie building railroads and to transport the oil and everything else. And they were working together. And all these people saying, well, you're taking advantage of labor and all of these things.
Right.
But these towns, there was never a need for a town in certain parts of the country. And it created opportunity for somebody to come in and say, hey, I'm going to open a saloon. I'm going to open a casino.
Yep.
I'm going to open a barber shop. I'm going to open a hotel or a motel. All of these types of things that allowed other people to create value, because now there was an opportunity because people wanted to live in these towns along where the railroad would stop. And to call them robber barons, we actually at the time redefined. We said, if you want to talk about who the real robber baron is, it's the tax collectors. It's the guys in government who are taking your money for taxes to redistribute to somebody else.
You know, it's funny, and I wasn't planning on talking about this, and I'll keep this brief, but it's so relevant to this discussion. I gave a talk here just recently. I was traveling and gave a talk about Abraham Lincoln and the whole sort of build up to the Civil War. And a big part of the problem that Lincoln is trying to solve is Stephen Douglas in 1854. He authors and pushes through Congress a measure that it repeals the Missouri Compromise. And importantly here, we don't need to go into all of the history there. What it did is it opened up this vast territory in the western United States. This is territory. This is before, these weren't states yet. This was just a big chunk of land owned by the United States. And prior to that, slavery had been prohibited. You couldn't take slave property out into the territory. There were no laws out there respecting slave property. Stephen Douglas's bill changes that. And it opens the gates to slavery. And part of that story I told, Douglas, Douglas, by the way, was celebrated by a generation of progressive historians within the university system. The first historians who wrote about the Civil War and Lincoln, that whole period, they held up Stephen Douglas as their hero. And you think, well, Douglas, why they said, because Douglas was a very intelligent relativist. Douglas said he didn't care about slavery. He didn't think slavery was right, didn't think it was wrong. He was a relativist. And so these historians say, see how smart Douglas was? See how learned he was? He's a nihilist like we are. And he's out there saying we don't have to fight over slavery because there's no right and wrong. And they denounced Lincoln. These same progressive historians denounced Lincoln because Lincoln is saying, no, slavery's wrong. Slavery is intrinsically wrong, regardless of how popular it is or how many people vote for it. Doesn't matter. It's always wrong. Back to Stephen Douglas, the reason he pushes this bill through, he really doesn't care about slavery. He doesn't care if slavery spreads out to the Western Territory or not. What he cares about, he's been meeting, he's in the Senate. He's in the United States Senate.
After defeating Lincoln.
That's right. He has access to all the private information. You know who he's talking to? He's talking to the guys who are surveying the western part of the United States where the railroad tracks are going to go.
Yep.
And you know what Stephen Douglas is doing? He's buying land, personally buying land where the railroad tracks are most likely to be built, because he knows that's just prairie out there right now. He can buy this land really cheap, and then towns will spring up, just like you're talking about, and that land will become much more valuable, and he becomes wealthy. And the whole problem he has is he needs some Southern senators to agree with him to organize that territory, have some territorial governments out there to protect the people building the railroads and things like that. And Southerners won't come on board if they can't take their slave property out there. They say, hey, Stephen, you won our votes. You change federal policy and let us take our slave property. He says, okay, done. And that's how we get the opening of the floodgates to let slavery into the Western territory. All happens because of the political cronyism, what Bert calls the political entrepreneurship, right, of Stephen A. Douglas.
Right.
He's not running a business. He's not creating value for people. He's getting wealthy by crony political inside trading, inside information. And the big point I want to make here is the more government that we have, the more regulations, the more subsidies, the more control that there is with government, the more that kind of political entrepreneurship you have. And that's true anywhere right. You go. It doesn't matter if it's North Korea or Yemen or right anywhere. I read, people talk about Elon Musk as the wealthiest person, and he might be, but who's right there with him? And these things are hard to judge because when you get into tyrannical regimes, it's harder to account for things.
Sure.
But way up there at the top, Vladimir Putin.
Right.
Among the wealthiest of the wealthy in the entire world. And you ask the question, what's Vladimir Putin done? And the answer is he's a political entrepreneur.
There are arguments being made. And like you said, it's so hard to calculate and nobody knows what his true wealth is. But there are arguments being made that Vladimir Putin himself is worth more than the entire GDP of Russia.
Right.
That he has more personal wealth than his country is producing on an annual basis. And you could look at the royal families in the Middle East as well, right?
Yes.
The Saudi princes and the princes in Oman and some of these large oil producing countries, Iran, the royal families who essentially own all the land and can take whatever they want.
There's so much packed right into that phrase, right? The royal family. Think about that phrase, the royal families. It means there's no free market. There's no open competition. It means there are a few oligarchic, elite families that are connected to the government. They are the government. They're in the government. And they carve out monopolies for themselves. And that's the way that you get wealthy in some kind of central planning, big government regulatory administrative state. And it just drives home this whole theme that we've been, talking about here of the income gap. What kind of regimes, what kind of ways of life really are good for poor people who don't want to be poor anymore, who want to create some wealth, and what kind of regimes are good for the elite few who want to hold on to their elite status and stay above everybody else, regardless of the fact that they may not be very smart, they may not be very entrepreneurial, they may not be good at competition.
Right. They might not have any idea on how to actually understand what people want to be able to create value. They're so disconnected from the rest of the people around them to be able to even have a conversation about what is value and what do people care about.
If I want to have the most winning sports team, I have two options. One is I build a great team and we practice hard, right? And we train and we go out and we compete really, really well with other teams. The other way to have the best team is just form my team and prevent everybody else from having a team.
Yeah.
If there's no other team, by definition, my team is the best team.
Well, there's a lot I would love to unpack there, but I want to go back to something you said a little bit ago.
Yeah.
That you made a really big point that kind of leads us into the other part of today's conversation, and that is you brought up the baby formula shortage.
Yeah.
Right. And we talked about supply and demand and this decrease in supply. There's also been a big battle happening on social media over the last 3 or 4 weeks. There have been many people who have started saying, you know what the best solution to the baby formula shortage is for right now? Breastfeeding. Do you know I was going there? I saw that smile start popping up. Now,
I had my initial reaction to this the first time I saw this story about shortage of baby formula. Because there are women, I'd probably men too, but I know of women who, like, this is a big deal, not just for their own kids, other people's children. If someone else is not breastfeeding, they get angry. They get upset about it because science tells us that breastfeeding has all kinds of benefits. All other things being equal, there are all kinds of benefits to a woman's natural breast milk for a newborn baby. And so when the story first came out of there's a shortage of formula, I thought, wait, you mean there are women out there using formula? They're choosing to feed their baby. And what popped in my head, because I often like to think like a progressive, someone ought to make a law. Someone ought to make a regulation, right? Outlawing, prohibiting formula. And yet here we are in very progressive modern America, and there are women choosing, for whatever reason, probably a variety of reasons, baby formula over breast milk.
Well, I was going to try to stay away from that part of the conversation altogether. I will make one quick comment. There are two different people at play in the breastfeeding scenario. And they are people, right? They're human beings.
Yeah.
You have the mother.
Yeah.
And you have the infant.
Yeah.
And both are affected by formula versus breastfeeding.
Yep.
I'm going to suggest you and I are in no position at the moment to take a firm stance one way or another. I'm going to choose to stay out of whether or not or what my beliefs are or anything else like that. If I'm ever married
I have children, and I wanted my children to be, if I had a say in it, I had a preference. I wasn't neutral on it. Yeah, I want my kids to be breastfed, which they were, and there are all kinds of benefits, health benefits that come from it.
Well, and there's also emotional connections and things like that. So but there was another inconsistency that came up through this whole conversation.
Yeah.
Because when you started seeing the women who were saying, well, the solution to this is you might not want to breastfeed, but we have to bring down demand. Supply is low. The only way to bring price down is to bring demand down.
Right.
Because we don't have an administration and we don't have a government at the moment who has a clue about how to decrease regulation so that supply can increase. They are over-regulating. They are shutting down plants. They are doing all these things.
To be clear, it was a government regulatory agency that shut down the production of baby formula
at Abbott Foods. So you have these women, a lot of women out there saying, well, there's an easy solution here. We're going to have to breastfeed. Whether you like it or not, breastfeeding will decrease demand and will help us through this scenario. And there are progressive women. I have a right to choose. I have a choice. I can do whatever I want. You can't tell me don't. And they're losing their minds over somebody suggesting that they should breastfeed. And all I can think about is only a couple of years ago, these same women, and I know these women because they are the same people I've been friends with on Facebook since the mid-2000s.
Yeah.
Only 2 or 3 years ago were the ones posting pictures of women breastfeeding all over Facebook, saying, stop the stigma that breastfeeding should be done in private.
Right. Yes.
Stop the stigma that women shouldn't breastfeed. Breastfeeding is beautiful and it's natural and it's great.
It should be encouraged.
And we should encourage these women to be breastfeeding in public.
Yes.
And I'm sitting there and now they're enraged.
Don't tell me to breastfeed.
Don't tell me to breastfeed. You can't tell me if and just the inconsistency there.
Yeah.
And it brings me to the biggest inconsistency that I think we're seeing in the progressive movement today. And this is going to be controversial, right? But
you're a controversial guy, Dave.
I tend to be. The biggest inconsistency right now is the idea of being pro-choice. Now, I'm not even talking about whether abortion is right or wrong or anything else.
Right.
But the mere fact of being pro-choice in abortion and having a choice to get an abortion and being a progressive is wholly inconsistent.
Yeah.
And it's strange to me. I've been sitting here racking my brain for weeks as I watch the reaction to this leaked document from Justice Alito.
Right.
Why is it that abortion has become the issue, or or the choice to be able to have an abortion, not even abortion itself, but
right.
the choice to have an abortion.
Right.
Why is that the hill of all hills that most progressives are willing to die on? They are willing to go fight that till the end. You want to, we talked about this a few weeks ago on our podcast. I think it was 3 podcasts ago. We talked about this could be what we look back on as the equivalent of Dred Scott, as the thing that triggers a civil war.
Right.
And why is it that this is the one topic, the one single topic that they are willing to die on that hill from?
And they're willing to die. You know, let's unpack these terms just a little bit, because what you're laying out here is that there's an incompatibility. There's a tension to that's a great term used by students and professors of political theory. There's a tension between choice and progressivism. That's what it really boils down to. Choice, I mean, I don't know, we need to spell that out much. I mean, choice really is synonymous with individual freedom.
Right.
Liberty. That, what does a free human being do? How does a free human being demonstrate his freedom or manifest his freedom? He makes choices, right? That is the essence of freedom, is making choices. And you have progressivism, which really is the result. Last week, our podcast last week, we kind of marched through the development of modern science, modern technological science. And progressivism is a cultural and a political, in a way, a religious movement that grows out of modern science. Modern science is very successful in many ways. It develops many technologies that changes the way that we live. And in many respects, not all, but in many respects, improves the way that we live. Transportation, communication. I mean, just think about all the things technology has achieved. And so for many people in the modern, especially in the modern Western world, it made sense to say, okay, modern technological science has given us trains and cars and airplanes and computers and medicines and all these other things. Why not just put modern technological science in charge of all of society? Just have scientists run everything, tell people how to run their business and how to educate their children and what medicines they're going to take or not going to take and what foods they're going to eat, and really every aspect of our lives. And there are a lot of people said, yeah, that sounds right. Science is the way to the future. That is what it means to be progressive, is to vest political power, vest government power into the hands of scientists, and then have them use that power to govern us, to rule over us, to tell us how to live. So you have progressivism, when you really distill it down, I mean, the essence of it is scientific central planning, which is incompatible with the idea of choice.
Right. And let's be clear. I made a distinction between being pro-abortion and being pro-choice, because the early progressives were not pro-choice, they were pro-abortion.
Right.
It's the eugenics movement of the early 20th century, of the late 19th century, the early 20th century, that we saw eugenics here. We saw the early writings of many progressives. This is sort of off the progressive or the abortion topic, but Charles Merriam's book in 1903, where he's talking about certain types of people have the capacity to participate in politics and have freedoms and liberties, and other people don't have the physical traits.
Let me put a little sharpen that edge. According to Charles Merriam, one of the great influential progressive social scientists, he says certain races have demonstrated the capacity and the fitness for self-government, and other races have not. They're clearly inferior. And so it would make sense for the superior races to control the procreation of the inferior races.
And let's be clear, he didn't just say some races and some don't. You figure out which.
Yeah,
he was very clear.
Yeah.
He used the term Teutonic.
Yes, right.
Is that correct? I mean, essentially, he's talking about white Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah.
But you had this whole movement, especially during the times of KKK and Jim Crow, where you had progressive Democrats, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, participating in these conversations about eugenics, where they're measuring the skulls of black people and saying, you see those dimples?
Right.
That dimple on that skull, which is common among many black Americans, that means they're incapable of having freedom. They need to be slaves because they're actually incapable. So there was no pro-choice in early progressivism. It was pro-abortion. We need to rid ourselves of some of these inferior people, and that was really the theme.
By the 1920s and the 1930s in the United States, progressivism had gone all the way as far as not merely pro-abortion, but even embracing the idea of like forced sterilization.
Right.
Like why just abort one baby from someone of a defective race because then that woman might go get pregnant again. Why not just forcibly sterilize her so that she can never get pregnant again? These were wildly popular ideas. In fact, I shouldn't joke about these things because they're really not funny. But I've made light of the fact that part of the progressive movement toward eugenics, the pro-abortion, the forced sterilization, the euthanasia, killing older people who weren't very productive, didn't have much money. The thing that slows all that down is a guy named Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
As the world comes to see, right, the grotesque horrors of the Holocaust, these enormous trenches filled with corpses, even progressives in the United States say, ugh, that is the extension of scientific central planning, but that is so ugly. We don't want to be part of that.
Now, do you think that was really the case? And I truly don't have an answer to this. I'm curious. Yeah. This is an opinion thing. I don't know that we have anything documented, and maybe there is that I'm not aware of, but do you think it was really they said, we don't want to be a part of that, or it's not politically expedient to be a part of that? I mean, remember, this is the same group who was making up the KKK, who was enacting Jim Crow. They didn't have a problem killing people who they thought weren't as good as them.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know that I'm prepared to answer it fully. I will trot out an example that I think is quite revealing. Some people may be familiar with in a way, the two alternative paths or ways in modern America are represented by two men who were contemporaries of each other. Booker T. Washington, we have talked about him some here on this program. He teamed up with Rosenwald and built all those schools throughout the South. So there's Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois.
Right.
They're active, writing, they're advocates, they're at the same time. Booker T. Washington is deeply concerned about the fate of millions of newly freed black men and women and children, many of whom used to be slaves, and he wants them to be productive. He's saying, learn something, get an education, get some skills, be productive, create some wealth, become independent.
Right.
The world is a dangerous, scary place. Don't depend on anybody or anything. Du Bois is a Harvard-educated progressive intellectual. And what's interesting about Du Bois, now this is among scholars, this is not a secret. People know this. They've written about this. Du Bois was fascinated with the rise of European fascism in the 1920s and the 1930s. And he was quite complimentary about the Nazis. Mm-hmm. And as recently as 10 years ago, historians were lamenting that, saying, this is a problem that this great progressive intellectual black man in America is complimenting German fascists and Nazis. And now what has happened just within the last few years, there's this wave of new scholarship on Du Bois, completely diminishing and he didn't really mean it.
Right.
When he was praising them as a model of a kind of scientific, what's the word I want to say, a technocratic regime. That's how W.E.B. Du Bois was praising Germans in the 1920s, and so I don't know how much. I mean, certainly when you see those images, right? I mean, they're grotesque. I mean, they're slaughtering human beings by the millions, and there comes a point in the 1930s where the biggest problem for the Germans is literally disposing of all these corpses.
Sure.
There are mountains of them. They're a health hazard. How do you get rid of so many dead that you've butchered and slaughtered? And so certainly there were people in the West, even progressives in the West, who look at that and go, I don't have the stomach for that, right? I don't want to go there and have that happen. You have other progressives who say, that's really going to slow down the advance of progressivism now, because people are going to emote, right, and be all sympathetic to all those dead Jews and others over in Germany. So we got to pause here the advance of progressivism,
right? And I will say this as somebody who's Jewish and has deep ties to the Holocaust. I don't like when people forget that was not just an attempt to eliminate Jews from Germany. Right. There were 13 million people killed in the Holocaust. 6 to 7 million of them were Jews.
Right.
The rest were black, were gay, were disabled. This was an approach to eugenics.
Yes.
In the clearest sense of the word. And so for anybody who does not want to try to tie early progressivism to Nazism, you're missing the point entirely.
In 1936, the Olympic Games were in Berlin, and the Americans had this incredible athlete and sprinter named Jesse Owens.
Right.
And when Adolf Hitler first saw Jesse Owens on the field, he accused the Americans of cheating because he said they're letting a monkey run.
Right.
And if they can enter a monkey, he wanted the Germans to enter a cheetah.
Right.
Right. That's the way that he thought about it. That was the scientific racism and eugenics that goes with the progressivism of the Nazi regime. And you are absolutely right. That thing called the Holocaust, above all, it's an exercise in progressive eugenics.
I don't want to get off topic, but you brought up Jesse Owens, and it's one of my favorite little known facts. Do you know who finished second in that race, in that famous race that Jesse Owens won? Jackie Robinson's older brother.
Oh, my goodness.
Jackie Robinson had a brother, I believe was about 10 or 11 years older than him.
Yeah.
Who was also a great baseball player, but was in his mid-30s by the time Jackie Robinson, but when Branch Rickey brought Jackie Robinson into the Dodgers, he had an older brother who was about 11 years older who finished second to Jesse Owens.
I did not know that.
And nobody talks about him.
Right.
But another black man running right next to Jesse Owens, Robinson's brother ended up being a janitor at a high school for his career because he was second to Jesse Owens. His brother was the famous baseball player.
Yep.
He never had that opportunity. He was always just right behind. But it's one of those little known facts that people don't remember. Back to the point we were making. I asked you that question because if you look through the writings of Margaret Sanger, for those who don't know, founder of Planned Parenthood, very open about her commitment to eugenics early on in her career, right? Planned Parenthood was created for eugenics, for the purposes of eugenics. It was she would originally talk about it, or eventually talk about it, as this idea of being able to free women from the burdens of an inferior child. But as you watch the Holocaust happen, and as she kept writing into the 40s, you did see this change. And it was sort of this change in her writing of, we're not just going to talk about eugenics. Now we need to make this about women's rights.
Yes.
And if you look today, the same way you talk about Du Bois, everybody ignores the first writings of her first half of her life they focus now on this idea of women's choice and being pro-choice and everything else. And I can't help but wonder, and we'll never have a chance to talk to Margaret Sanger and ask her, and maybe even if we could, would we ever get the truth?
Right.
But I can't help but wonder, was she genuine, which I don't believe she was, or was she Lyndon Johnson saying, when I sign this bill, we're going to get these
black people, but he didn't say black
people.
Didn't
say black people voting for us for the next 200 years.
Yeah.
And you just see that transition in the writing that has been manipulated into today what we have.
There's another piece of this, and I don't want to go too far because this gets into really deep theoretical waters very quickly, but it's worth pointing out. Part of that march of modern science that we talked about last time, the classical view was that there are certain permanent features and aspects to human life, to the human condition, not all of which is pleasant. And so on the one hand, we need to learn and practice living virtuously, living well, knowing part of living well for the classics was learning how to suffer well, because there is going to be suffering. Life is probably going to be short. It's going to be difficult. And learning how to suffer well rather than suffering like a brat, right, is part of the classical teaching. The modern science comes along and says, well, why suffer?
Right.
What if we can just get rid of suffering? Then you don't have to learn how to live well, and especially not the suffering well. And so there is this push against human nature itself to transform, what used to be called the natural law that was inseparable from the human condition. And the natural law, human nature, includes things like parenthood, motherhood, fatherhood, that doing these things, right? Having children, raising children, breastfeeding children, that these aren't obstacles to be removed from human life. This is part of being a human being. This is part of what human beings do,
right,
and learn how to do it well, right? Yeah. And so Sanger does represent part of that radical kind of postmodern attempt to use the tools of science to really change the natural human condition, so that growing numbers of women, for example, don't have to be bothered with things like raising a child or breastfeeding a child, right? Attending to a newborn child. This becomes a key feature of modern feminism. Why be burdened? Why have women burdened with children rather than, pursuing education and careers, sure, and things like that? But your bigger point, there certainly is a change in her emphasis. We've thrown around this word eugenics, and I think it's good to offer a kind of definition. I mean, I would define eugenics, and then I would invite, if someone has a better definition or a clearer definition, eugenics is the scientific planning of the human gene pool. Mm-hmm. What kind of genes are going to be allowed to exist, and what kind of lines of genes and chromosomes and everything else, right, get cut off and are removed from the human gene pool. And that is certainly a big priority for her in her original writings, is that scientific planning of the human gene pool. And then later it becomes much more about empowering women, liberating women from the natural burdens of, childbirth and child rearing.
Well, so as we try to wrap up this conversation, which could go on for a lot longer, I want to bring it into the modern conversation. And we talked about some of the inconsistencies of progressive conversation. Mm-hmm. You have this inconsistency of believing that everything, that science, you go see the yard signs, we believe in science,
right?
And a progressive believing that society should listen to what its scientific experts mm-hmm. have to say. A scientific expert could very easily make an argument that we should perfect the gene pool by not allowing certain people to be born or have those people destroyed, killed, in the case of
many
Nazi Germany, and many have over the years.
Some still do today.
Correct.
What's his name? I can't. I think he's still alive. He was out of Stanford for a long time.
Kevorkian? Is that who you're talking about?
No. I'll I'll think of it later, and I'll have to mention it probably on another podcast. Prominent political theorist who's made the case for eugenics, up to and including, killing people, especially if they're poor and they're a drain on other people's resources. Right. Once you hit 75 or 80, just that's it. Lights out.
Well, that's become a big conversation of should 75 be the maximum lifespan of a human being in America. I mean, which is an insane conversation to me for another time. But so that inconsistency, I think, shows a couple of things. One, we saw that shift with Margaret Sanger. We saw that shift with LBJ when it came to the Civil Rights Act and civil rights and getting rid of separate but equal and things like that. And the way he went about it caused all kinds of problems. We've talked about some of the issues with the Civil Rights Act and things like that. However, what we have seen is a change throughout the progressive movement of moments when progressives realize that they still have, that at their core, people still want freedom. Freedom is still important. And we see people out there right now saying, if you see somebody use the word freedom, they're a far right extremist. Those same people are pro-choice. Those same people are the ones willing to die on the hill of Roe versus Wade, of pro-choice, of everything else. And to say that just shows that at the end of the day, people understand that for political expediency, sometimes you can't be a full-blown progressive. You have to offer freedom. People need freedom. They crave freedom. They subconsciously demand freedom.
So even if you're progressive, you got to praise it a little bit.
You got to praise freedom here and there,
because choice is synonymous with freedom. So one of the recommendations I'd offer people, when you hear someone say, I'm pro-choice, just ask them, so you're pro-freedom. You're for freedom, right? Because the choice means freedom, the freedom to choose. You're for freedom. And probably what will happen with a lot of progressives is they'll immediately backpedal. Well, for freedom in certain areas or for certain people in certain circumstances.
But this goes back to what I have argued since day one of the Vino Veritas Society, day one of the podcast. If you ask the right questions like that, and you let them talk, progressives will talk themselves in circles and get themselves caught in their own net, and just let them go, because eventually they're going to realize I'm not making any sense, and they get frustrated and they walk away. And yes, we don't like it when they won't engage, and we've dealt with that for years, where you can't get a progressive on stage to actually debate or discuss. But at least you hope that frustration is going to drive them to go home and think, maybe not because they want to understand better, but they want to think, well, how could I have answered that better so I don't look so stupid next time, and I don't look silly, because I know they're convinced in their head they're right, but as they start to keep playing it, they're going to realize there is no right answer in the direction I'm going.
The other important thing to remember, many of those conversations where they begin with a few simple questions, and you just let progressives answer, often there are third parties watching and listening. And that also can be of great benefit, just to have people sit and observe and listen and watch progressives talk themselves into those circles.
Right. Well, I think this is a conversation that we will have on and off throughout the future. I am sure when Alito's decision, if it stays as is, when it's handed down, we will continue that conversation. I hope we did some justice to the conversation in a limited time. But this is what it takes, and those conversations are what it takes to guard the American idea, as we do in the Vino Veritas Society.
Nos sumos custodes.